Okay, part two. So after this debate, which showed both consensus on certain issues but also the limits of consensus, the Council transmitted its its understanding on the relationship between human rights and climate change to the Conference of Parties, the COP, of the UNFCCC ahead of COP15 in Copenhagen and COP16 in Cancun. Why did it do this? Because the Malé Declaration in its roadmap had been very clear that, of course, the Human Rights Council should take the lead in understanding, delineating, clarifying the relationship between climate change and the international human rights legal obligations and responsibilities of states, because that's the mandate of the Human Rights Council. But the Human Rights Council itself clearly on its own is not in a position or is not mandated to solve the problem of climate change. The part of the UN that's there to deal with and develop international action on climate change is the UNFCCC, and particularly the Conference of Parties there too. So the Council, after doing all of this work, which I've just talked about, wisely, in my view, took that emerging body of work and transferred it over to the Conference of Parties, to the UNFCCC, for the latter's attention and for the latter to take further action by integrating human rights into its work, so by using that emerging understanding developed by the Human Rights Council. In Copenhagen, where I was, so I should disclose, obviously at this point, you may have guessed already, I was a diplomat throughout this process, working for the Maldives, was working from the very beginning on the Malé Declaration, the Malé Small States Human Dimension of Climate Change Conference, and was leading the Maldives' efforts at the Human Rights Council to draft and negotiate these resolutions, to organise the panel debates, to work with the Office of the High Commission of the Human Rights on the report. That's not to say it was only me. There was a huge number of NGOs, academics, different other small island states. So it really was an evolving movement on this. After the human rights climate change work at the Council, myself and the rest of the delegation of the Maldives and the Alliance of Small Island States moved the fight to Copenhagen for the climate change conference COP15, where we struggled to get human rights and the work of the Human Rights Council recognised in the negotiating text on long-term cooperative action. As we all know, Copenhagen didn't really result in an agreement, although there was the Copenhagen Accord. So then the fight passed over, or the struggle passed over to Cancun and COP16. And there, for a number of reasons, we were able to have success. One of the reasons was Maldives, Switzerland and others really kept on pushing. Another reason was that the former president of the Human Rights Council, Luis Alfonso de Alba, happened to have been appointed the Mexican climate change envoy, who was really in charge of coordinating agreement at Cancun. And obviously, as a former president of the council, he had a particular interest in human rights and the human rights aspects of climate change. And so in the final negotiations, he really did a great job in terms of pushing for the inclusion of this wording when I would say a majority of states parties to the UNFCCC wanted absolutely to get rid of this. But it's there. So Decision 1/CP16 of the Cancun Agreements 2011 notes, and I quote, notes Resolution 10/4 of the Human Rights Council on Human Rights and Climate Change, which recognises that the adverse effects of climate change have a range of direct and indirect implications for the effective enjoyment of human rights, and that the effects of climate change will be felt most acutely by those segments of the population that are already vulnerable, owing to geography, gender, age, indigenous or minority status, or disability. So again, you see Mali Declaration language flowing into Human Rights Council language, flowing into UNFCCC language. So a great kind of diplomatic success. And then that was more kind of preambular language, but very importantly, in the operative parts of Decision 1/CP16, paragraph 8, emphasises that parties should, in all climate change related actions, fully respect human rights. A very powerful, important wording, which probably is a high point, even post-Paris. It's a high point in terms of having strong human rights wording in operative parts of an international climate change agreement. What happened after COP16? Well, not much, unfortunately. For whatever reasons, I think the Maldives took its foot off the pedal. Maybe the NGO community didn't see things clearly enough in terms of what needed to come next. The Alliance of Small Island States maybe lost interest. So not much happened after that, which was a huge disappointment. And what should have happened, of course, is that the international climate change policy community should have taken those few key words in the Cancun agreements and really transformed it into better policies, both at international level and national level, in terms of what does that mean? What does it mean to say that parties should, in all climate change actions, fully respect human rights? Maybe developing guidelines, developing a separate decision of the COP, really putting meat on the bones. And fortunately, none of that happened. And academia didn't really do much either in terms of really thinking about what should happen next at the climate change level, at the UNFCCC level. Because nothing was happening really at the UNFCCC, attention returned to the Human Rights Council. What happened there? Well, really the key countries behind human rights and climate change, so by this time Maldives, Switzerland and Costa Rica, decided to go further, keep pushing. And what they wanted to do was really take the consensus that had been achieved earlier and push on. So really clarify international human rights law obligations related to climate change and other types of environmental harm. So the Council then went on to adopt Resolution 1611 in 2011 on human rights and climate change. It's very important to point out this wasn't an abandonment of human rights and climate change resolutions. It was really a recognition that we'd perhaps reached the limit of useful debate on that issue because certain states just didn't want to go any further. And so by taking a step sideways and looking at the relationship between human rights and environment more broadly, it was felt that more progress could be made. But really the language repeated a lot of the language from previous human rights and climate change resolutions, talking about the impacts of environmental harm on human rights, but also saying that human rights obligations and commitments have the potential to inform and strengthen international, regional and national policy making in the area of environmental protection. This led to Resolution 1910, which was really a post 1972 high point in the international movement to connect human rights, environment and climate change, because it led to the establishment of a new UN Special Procedure mandate on human rights and the environment, called the UN Independent Expert on Human Rights and the Environment. And the first mandate holder was appointed was Professor John Knox from the United States, who's long been involved in this agenda, so it's really an excellent first mandate holder. And the mandate given to this independent expert was, and again quoting, to study the human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and identify, promote and exchange views on best practice relating to the use of human rights obligations and commitments to inform, support and strengthen environmental policy making. what was his real task? That was his official task, but his real task, and again, I'm saying this because I drafted and negotiated the text, so there was a hidden agenda in there. And really it was to see if this new special rapporteur, independent expert, could deal with these long-standing, very difficult questions, essential to really future progress. First of all, the question of extraterritoriality. Do human rights obligations in the context of transnational issues or concerns such as climate change, do human rights obligations extend beyond a sovereign nation's borders? So in other words, is the US liable for the human rights harm that its greenhouse gas emissions cause in the Maldives? So this key question of extraterritoriality, very fertile ground for academic research. And secondly, can this human rights harm be classified as a human rights violation in a strict legal sense? I don't need to, I think, explain the potential political and legal implications of being able, as an international community, to make those leaps and make those leaps effectively, successfully, and consensually. Last few slides. At the end of the initial 3-year mandate of the independent expert, the Council decided to upgrade the special procedure, so change it from an independent expert into a special rapporteur, which is a more powerful mandate. And really, this change meant that it was still John Knox who continued into a second 3-year term, but he could focus now less on clarifying norms and clarifying obligations and clarifying legal questions, to really focusing on promoting the implementation of that normative framework. And it also meant he could, in principle, now start to address violations of human rights through country missions, so for example, visiting vulnerable countries or visiting vulnerable communities, and through receiving petitions or individual complaints by people that feel as though their human rights have been impacted by environmental harm and climate change, and/or climate change. Latest developments, of course, Paris. What happened there was that John Knox really led an international effort to bring the human rights agenda back to the UNFCCC, again, not on his own, a huge number of actors, NGOs, Mary Robinson, vulnerable countries, really pushed for human rights to be integrated again into thinking at the COP. And the special rapporteur especially was able to act as a kind of focal point for that efforts. One thing, for example, he did with another of other UN special rapporteurs is he produced a paper which was submitted to the UNFCCC on the human rights impacts of a 2-degree as opposed to a 1.5-degree increase in global average temperatures. Hugely important document, really kind of encapsulated and captured the human rights impacts of climate change at those different levels. Of course, that fed into debates at the UNFCCC on whether the target for the Paris Agreement should be 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And yeah, he worked with the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, NGOs and others to push, again, human rights to be included. And it was included. It wasn't included as what it was during Cancun in the operative parts, but it was included, quite strong wording, in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but just to repeat, with the Paris Agreement, states parties acknowledged, and I quote, that climate change is a common concern of humankind. Parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment and intergenerational equity. Last goal then. What's the end goal of this? In my opinion, the end goal. Well, firstly, what should happen next? Hopefully, people won't make the same mistake as they did after Cancun and just leave it there. It really is a case now of interested groups taking that Paris wording and putting the meat on the bones, really looking what it means in terms of international and domestic climate change policy, offering guidance to states, really creating a framework for using human rights to promote better climate policies in line with 1.5 degrees and in line with the needs of and the rights of people in vulnerable situations or vulnerable countries. But beyond that, the end goal for me has always been that the next time that a group such as the Inuit bring a case against a high polluting state like the US to an organization or a body like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, that hopefully next time the human rights issues and questions and the relationship between human rights and climate change and these issues of extraterritoriality and whether it represents a human rights violation will be clearer, so that next time the Inuit or the Maldives or anyone brings a case at international level or regional level or domestic level, who knows, perhaps next time they'll win. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you.